At Christmas dinner, my white brother-in-law mocked the painting my 5-year-old daughter made for Grandma. When I defended her, my mother-in-law slapped me 3 times and spat, "You are trash. My son deserves better." Then she pointed at my daughter and ordered us out. My husband took my hand. "Let us go." 2 hours later, his father called. "Your mother just found out." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers in my mother-in-law, Beatrice's Buckhead mansion, cast a warm golden glow over the dining table, but the atmosphere was freezing. I am Nia, 32 years old, and for the last 7 years I have endured the suffocating arrogance of a family that prides itself on being the black elite. Beatrice, a woman obsessed with country club memberships, and her legacy in an exclusive sorority, never missed a chance to remind me that I came from a working-class neighborhood. She hated my darker skin, hated my humble beginnings, and hated that her successful son Marcus chose me over the polished society girls she paraded in front of him. But that night the hostility went from passive-aggressive whispers to outright violence. It started when my 5-year-old daughter Zuri proudly walked around the table holding a handmade Christmas card she had painted for her grandmother. Zuri was a sweet, quiet girl who loved art, and she had spent hours mixing the colors. She handed the slightly crumpled paper to Beatrice. Instead of thanking her granddaughter, Beatrice wrinkled her nose and passed it down the table to Chloe, my sister-in-law, and her husband Connor. Connor was a white crypto investor who recently married into the family. Beatrice practically worshipped the ground he walked on, because in her twisted mind, having a white son-in-law who talked about tech startups brought a new level of prestige to the family. Connor took Zuri's painting, held it up with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, and smirked. "Wow, Zuri," he said using a mockingly exaggerated accent. "This is really something. The chaotic lines, the messy colors. It fits right in with the South Side slums. That maternal street blood is really showing today." Laughter erupted from Chloe. Beatrice smiled approvingly while sipping her champagne. My father-in-law Harrison simply looked down at his plate, too cowardly to ever speak up against his wife. The blood pounded in my ears. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. "Put the painting down, Connor," I said, my voice dangerously low, "and do not ever speak to my daughter like that again." Chloe rolled her eyes and tossed her long, expensive hair over her shoulder. "God, Nia, you are always so defensive. Connor is just joking. It is not our fault you cannot handle our sense of humor. You are always trying to bring the mood down." "I am not bringing the mood down," I fired back. "I am demanding basic respect for a 5-year-old child. Your husband is a grown man mocking a little girl because it makes him feel superior." That was when Beatrice slammed her hand onto the table. The silver cutlery rattled. "Sit down and stop embarrassing yourself in my house, Nia," she snapped. Her eyes were full of venom. "Connor is a successful financial mind who brings actual class to this table. He is right. The drawing is a mess, just like the background you came from. You should be taking notes from him instead of throwing a ghetto tantrum." I stared at the woman who was supposed to be my family. "Class," I repeated, stepping away from the table. "You think a man who belittles a child has class? You are so blinded by your obsession with status and his skin color that you let him disrespect your own granddaughter." Beatrice stood up, her face twisted in absolute fury. She marched around the long dining table, closing the distance between us before I could even process her movement. Without a word of warning, she raised her hand and struck me across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the silent dining room. Before I could react, she swung again, and then a third time. 3 stinging slaps that left my cheeks burning and my vision briefly blurring. Zuri screamed, hiding behind my legs. "You are trash!" Beatrice spat, her voice trembling with hatred. "You have always been trash. My son deserves a woman of our caliber, not some bottom-of-the-barrel charity case who does not know her place." She pointed a manicured finger at Zuri, who was sobbing into my skirt. "Grab your little mistake and get out of my house." The silence that followed was suffocating. I tasted blood on the inside of my cheek. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just looked at Beatrice, memorizing the cruel satisfaction on her face. Then the sound of shattering crystal pierced the air. Marcus had grabbed his full wine glass and hurled it against the dining room wall. Dark red liquid splattered across the expensive wallpaper like a fresh wound. Marcus walked over to me, his chest heaving. He picked Zuri up, holding her tightly against his chest, and grabbed my hand with a grip so firm it felt like an anchor. He looked at his mother, his eyes completely devoid of the warmth he usually carried. "Do not ever touch my wife again," Marcus said, his voice deadly calm. "Do not ever look at my daughter again. We are leaving. And as of tonight, I do not have a mother." "Marcus, do not you dare walk out that door," Beatrice yelled as we turned our backs. "If you leave with her, you are cutting yourself off from this family's legacy. You are choosing nothing over everything." I did not even pause. Marcus guided me out the front door and into the freezing December night, leaving the shouting and the chaos behind us. We strapped a crying Zuri into her car seat, wrapped a blanket around her, and got into the front seats. The moment the car doors closed, insulating us from the world outside, Marcus reached over and pulled me into his arms. He kissed my forehead, apologizing repeatedly for his mother's actions, his voice breaking with a mixture of anger and deep sorrow. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as we drove away from the wealthy neighborhood. The physical pain on my face was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Beatrice thought she had won. She thought she had finally discarded the trash she despised so much. She thought her legacy and her precious son-in-law were untouchable. She had absolutely no idea who she had just slapped. She only saw a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. She never bothered to understand that I worked as a corporate liquidation and restructuring executive specializing in distressed assets and failed companies. I had built Phoenix Commercial Holdings quietly. I did not need her country club legacy, because my career was built on reading the paperwork behind collapsing empires and deciding what could still be saved. 2 hours passed. We were driving down the interstate, the rhythmic hum of the tires, the only sound in the car, as Zuri had finally fallen asleep in the back. The digital clock on the dashboard read 11:30 at night. Suddenly, Marcus's phone lit up in the center console. The caller ID showed it was Harrison, my father-in-law. Marcus stared at it, his jaw tightening, and made no move to answer. "Answer it," I said quietly. "Let us see what kind of apology he is trying to piece together." Marcus pressed the button to answer and put it on speakerphone. "Dad, unless you are calling to tell me you have filed for divorce from that woman, I do not want to hear it." Marcus Harrison gasped. His voice was completely frantic, lacking any of his usual passive calm. I could hear heavy breathing and the sound of muffled shouting in the background. "Marcus, you need to come back right now." "What is going on?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting from angry to concerned. "It is your mother," Harrison cried into the phone. "The police are here. There are deputies standing in the foyer right now. They are holding an eviction notice. They said this house was foreclosed on 2 months ago. Your mother just found out. Connor is packing his bags and trying to run out the back door. I do not understand what is happening." I leaned back against the leather seat and let a small, genuine smile cross my face for the first time that night. The storm had finally hit. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned light gray. His eyes darted between the dark road ahead and the glowing phone screen in the center console. I watched his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. Before his father called, the silence in the car had been heavy with unspoken apologies. Marcus had spent the first 20 minutes of our drive trying to find the words to heal the damage his mother had done. He told me he was disgusted by her blind worship of Connor. He said she was so obsessed with proximity to white wealth that she let a mediocre crypto broker treat her own flesh and blood like garbage. He apologized for her colorism, for the way she constantly belittled my darker skin and working-class roots, while praising Chloe and Connor for simply existing in their designer clothes. He had promised me we would never go back to that house. Now that house was apparently slipping through his parents' fingers. "Dad, slow down," Marcus said, leaning closer to the phone. "What do you mean foreclosed? Mom owns the house outright. It has been in the family for 30 years. Harrison let out a sound that was half sob and half gasp. "I thought she did, Marcus. I thought the mortgage was paid off. But the sheriff is standing in the foyer. They have the paperwork. Your mother signed a reverse mortgage package and the lender completed foreclosure 60 days ago after default. $3 million came out of the house. Marcus slammed his hand against the steering wheel. $3 million. For what? For Connor, Harrison cried out. The words hung in the air heavy and suffocating. Harrison's voice broke as he explained the disaster unfolding in their living room. Connor had convinced Beatrice that his new cryptocurrency trading platform was going to make them billionaires. He told her she needed to invest heavily to get in on the ground floor before the company went public. He promised her returns that would double her net worth in a month. He played on her desperate need to be seen as a financial elite. He used big words, dropped names of Wall Street executives he had never actually met, and Beatrice swallowed every single lie. She signed the papers without telling me, Harrison wept. The reverse mortgage proceeds went out almost immediately. She gave Connor everything, Marcus. Every dollar she could reach from the equity. He never made the required payments or cured the default. By the time I understood what had happened, the foreclosure had already been completed and the distressed property had moved into a liquidation process. In the background of the call, I could hear the distinct sound of heavy boots on hardwood floors. A deep voice, presumably a deputy, was instructing someone to step away from a cabinet. Then came the unmistakable sound of Chloe screaming. She was shrieking at Connor, demanding to know where he was going with a duffel bag. "He is trying to leave us," Harrison said, panic raising the pitch of his voice. He grabbed his passport from the safe. "Marcus, he is leaving your sister. He told the police he does not live here and has nothing to do with the property." I sat quietly in the passenger seat, listening to the absolute destruction of Beatrice's perfect world. She had traded her family's safety for the illusion of prestige. She had slapped me, called me trash, and kicked my 5-year-old daughter out into the cold to defend a man who was currently packing his bags to abandon her to the police. The irony was so sharp it almost burned. "Let me speak to him!" A shrill voice shrieked through the speaker. There was the sound of a scuffle, and then Beatrice was on the line. She was breathing heavily, her voice stripped of its usual haughty refinement. "Marcus, are you there?" "I am here, Mom," Marcus replied coldly. "What did you do?" "Never mind that right now," Beatrice snapped, her arrogance attempting to mask her sheer terror. "The sheriff says the foreclosure was completed 60 days ago, and some corporate liquidation company now owns the property. They have a possession order, and they are telling us the deadline has expired. I need you to fix this." "Fix it?" Marcus asked in disbelief. "Mom, you secretly mortgaged the family home for $3 million to give to a con artist. How exactly am I supposed to fix that?" "You work in finance," Beatrice yelled. "You have connections. Just wire me $50,000 right now. I will hand it to these trash bankers and tell them to back off. Just give me enough to stall the eviction until Connor can get his company funds unlocked. Connor says the money is just frozen in an offshore account. We just need time." She was still defending him. Even as he was actively fleeing the scene of his crime, Beatrice was still clinging to the delusion that her golden son-in-law was a tech genius. She could not admit she had been played. She could not admit that the white prestige she worshipped was actually a cheap scam. "Mom, Connor is not unlocking any funds," Marcus said, rubbing his forehead. "He is a fraud. He stole your money." "Stop being jealous of him," Beatrice screamed into the receiver. "You have always been jealous of his success. Just send the $50,000. You and your wife owe me that much after the scene you caused tonight. Pay off these bottom-feeding corporate vultures so I can get my house back." I had heard enough. I reached over the center console and pulled the phone closer to me. The cool night air rushing past my window matched the temperature of my blood. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a woman who held all the cards. "There are no bottom-feeding corporate vultures here, ma'am," I said smoothly. Beatrice stopped breathing. For a full 5 seconds, the line was completely dead. When she finally spoke, her voice was a venomous hiss. "Nia, put my son back on the phone. This is family business. I do not have time for your ghetto interference." "It is not family business anymore, Beatrice," I replied. "It is real estate business. Your house went through foreclosure 60 days ago. Before completion, the distressed mortgage was acquired for cash by a company specializing in bad debt and liquidation. That company then took title through the completed process. You are wrong about who controls it. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. The company is Phoenix Commercial Holdings, I continued. We specialize in distressed assets, corporate restructuring, and liquidation. We paid cash for the position. I do not care what the name of the company is, Beatrice snapped. Just tell Marcus to send the money to them. Marcus cannot do that, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Because he does not own Phoenix Commercial Holdings. I do. I am its sole owner and chief executive. I authorize the acquisition of the distressed mortgage and the completed foreclosure position on your mansion. A sharp gasp echoed through the speaker. It sounded like all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of her grand foyer. You are lying, Beatrice whispered. Her voice was trembling now. The unshakable confidence was finally cracking. You are a nobody. You do not have that kind of money. You never bothered to ask what I do for a living, I reminded her. You were too busy mocking my background to notice that I restructure failed companies and acquire distressed assets for a living. The loan package crossed my desk 2 months ago. I saw the address, reviewed the debt, and authorized the purchase under the same controls my company uses for every distressed transaction. Your problem was already real before my name ever appeared in the file. You cannot do this, Beatrice shrieked. It was a guttural, desperate sound. This is my house. Not anymore, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. You told me to take my trash and get out of your house, so I did. Now I am telling you to pack up your bags and get out of mine. Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound awe. He knew I was successful, but he had no idea I had personally acquired his mother's defaulted mortgage. He did not say a word to stop me. In fact, he reached out and gently squeezed my knee, a silent gesture of absolute support. He was letting me execute the justice his mother so desperately deserved. On the other end of the line, sheer chaos erupted. I could hear Harrison asking what was wrong. I heard Beatrice hyperventilating. Then Chloe's voice pierced through the speaker, hysterical and shrill. Mom, what is she saying? Chloe demanded. Connor just locked himself in the guest bathroom with his laptop. The police are asking for his identification. Mom, what did you do? Beatrice ignored her daughter. She spoke directly into the phone, her voice dropping to a desperate, shaking plea. Nia, please. You cannot put us on the street on Christmas. We are family. You are my granddaughter's mother. I looked in the rearview mirror at Zuri sleeping peacefully in her car seat, completely unaware of the generational curse I was breaking for her. You did not care about your granddaughter when you slapped her mother in front of her, I said, my voice hardening into steel. You did not care about family when you called us trash. You bet your entire legacy on a white con artist because you hated your own reflection. Now you have to live with the consequences of that investment. I did not end the call yet. I told Beatrice there was one more problem. Connor was not a misunderstood tech genius. Federal investigators had been tracing complaints tied to his crypto venture, and Phoenix had preserved records matching those complaints. The deputies at the mansion were not there only for the property. A federal arrest warrant had been issued for Connor in the fraud investigation. From the background, Connor shouted that his lawyers would destroy me. I heard Chloe gasp and a door slam. I told Beatrice that paperwork, not prestige, controlled what happened next. Then I said goodnight, ended the call, and let the silence return to the car. Marcus drove in silence for less than a minute before his phone began vibrating again. This time Chloe's name flashed across the dashboard over and over. He ignored the first call, then the second. On the third, I told him to answer. Not because I wanted to hear another insult, but because I knew panic makes people reveal priorities they can hide when they feel safe. The moment Marcus put the call on speaker, Chloe was screaming. She said Connor had gotten out through a side door while Beatrice argued with the deputies. He had taken a black suitcase from the upstairs safe, shoved cash and 2 laptops inside, and sprinted toward the detached garage. Beatrice had actually stepped into the hallway and demanded that the deputies explain the eviction paperwork again, keeping their attention on her, while Connor slipped behind them. Harrison had tried to block him at the garage entrance, but Connor shoved past him, jumped into his car, and tore out through the rear gate. Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second. He asked Chloe whether she understood what she had just admitted. She did not. She kept screaming that Connor was scared and that scared people sometimes make dramatic choices. She insisted he was not fleeing. He was only going somewhere private so he could call his attorneys. She said the suitcase was full of business records he needed to defend himself. She even blamed the deputies for frightening him. Then Beatrice grabbed the phone. Her voice was breathless but still commanding. She told Marcus to stop asking useless questions and use his financial contacts to make the warrant disappear. She demanded that he call someone at a bank, someone at a courthouse, anyone with enough influence to protect Connor until the misunderstanding passed. Marcus stared ahead at the black ribbon of interstate and asked his mother whether she could hear herself. She had watched Connor drain $3 million from her house, abandon her during an eviction and run from officers with a suitcase, yet she was still trying to protect him. Beatrice snapped that family protects family. Marcus answered that she had used the word family while slapping his wife and pointing at his 5-year-old daughter like she was garbage. He told her not to use that word with him tonight. A different sound cut through the call. Sirens distant at first, then growing louder. Chloe stopped speaking. Harrison shouted that federal agents had just arrived at the mansion and were demanding to know which vehicle Connor had taken. Beatrice began talking over everyone, insisting Connor was an innocent businessman who had been driven into panic by a vindictive daughter-in-law. Marcus said nothing. He simply lowered the volume and kept driving. Connor did not make it to the airport. We learned the details in fragments over the next 40 minutes, mostly because Chloe kept calling Marcus, as though he had somehow become the emergency operations center for a disaster he had warned them about for years. Connor had taken I-85 south, apparently believing speed and Christmas traffic would give him enough distance to reach the airport. The agents already had his vehicle description and plate. They coordinated with units ahead of him, and before he reached the airport exits, unmarked federal vehicles boxed him into the right lane and forced him onto the shoulder. Chloe described it between sobs. She had tracked his phone until the signal stopped moving. Then an attorney connected to Connor called her and confirmed that he had been taken into federal custody. Agents recovered the suitcase, the cash, the laptops, and his passport. Whatever story he planned to tell about a misunderstood startup became harder to sell the moment he was found driving toward an international airport with money and travel documents after officers had appeared at the house. For the first time that night, Chloe's arrogance vanished. Her voice turned small. She asked Marcus to help her. He told her to be specific. She said Connor would have an initial appearance and that his lawyers were talking about a secured bond that could reach $1 million once the government argued he was a flight risk. She demanded that Marcus move $1 million into an account controlled by Connor's defense team so they could be ready to post whatever bond the court required. She said he had to do it before the government froze more assets. She reminded Marcus that she was his little sister. She said this was what brothers were for. Marcus let out a sound that was not quite laughter. He asked where that family loyalty had been when Connor mocked Zuri's skin in her painting. He asked where Chloe's loyalty had been when their mother struck me 3 times. He reminded her that she had laughed. Chloe immediately changed tactics. She said she had been shocked. She said she never thought Beatrice would actually hit me. She said Connor had been poisoning everyone's thinking, and that she was a victim too. Marcus pulled onto a quiet exit and stopped beneath the harsh white lights of a closed gas station so he could give her his full attention. He told her no. One word, calm, final. Chloe shrieked that he could afford it. She said he worked in financial risk and knew wealthy people, he corrected her. Knowing how money works did not mean he had a spare $1 million to rescue a man accused of fraud, and even if he did, he would not spend 1 cent helping Connor escape consequences. Chloe accused him of choosing me over his blood again. Marcus said he was choosing his daughter over the people who had treated her like an inconvenience. Then Beatrice came back onto the call. Her grief had mutated into rage. She told me this was all my fault. She said I had bought the house because I wanted revenge-fed information to federal agents, because I was jealous of Connor and orchestrated his arrest to humiliate her in front of Buckhead. I listened to the accusation with complete stillness. She had a remarkable ability to stand in the center of a crater and blame the person who pointed out the explosives. I told her I had not made Connor forge disclosures. I had not made her sign away $3 million. I had not made him run toward an airport with cash and a passport. I had not made her hide the mortgage from Harrison. I had not made Chloe laugh at a child. And I certainly had not made Beatrice raise her hand to my face. She had spent years confusing consequences with persecution. Tonight the difference had finally become expensive. Beatrice screamed that I had destroyed the family. Marcus reached over and ended the call before I could answer. He sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. Then he looked at me and said something that mattered more than any apology he had offered earlier. He said he was done translating his family's cruelty into softer language. He was done calling abuse tradition colorism preference theft, bad judgment and silence peace. If they wanted to rebuild anything with him, they would have to start with truth, and he no longer believed most of them were capable of it. I reached across the console and took his hand. In the back seat, Zuri slept with her cheek against the window. One tiny fist still closed around the corner of the blanket Marcus had wrapped around her. That was the only family I was thinking about. The rest could answer for themselves. When we finally pulled back onto the road, neither Marcus nor I spoke for several miles. The adrenaline that had held us upright all evening was beginning to drain away, and underneath it was the simple fact that our daughter had watched adults she trusted turn Christmas into a threat. Marcus kept glancing into the rearview mirror. Each time he saw Zuri asleep, his jaw tightened. He told me he had spent years believing he could manage his mother by limiting contact, redirecting conversations, and stepping between us whenever her comments became obvious. He had treated her colorism like a bad habit instead of what it was, a belief system that eventually reached our child. The Christmas dinner proved that moderation had failed. Beatrice did not merely dislike me. She believed she possessed the right to rank human beings, and Connor gave her a new language for the same old prejudice. I told Marcus that guilt would not help Zuri. Action would. We needed to decide what she would see from us next. Not revenge. Stability. No screaming phone calls around her. No relatives showing up without permission. No explanations that made her responsible for adult conflict. If she asked why Grandma hit Mommy, we would answer simply and truthfully, Grandma made a wrong and unsafe choice, so we left. Marcus nodded. He said he wanted to document everything from Christmas night while it was fresh: Connor's insult, Chloe's laughter, Beatrice's 3 slaps, the threat to throw us out, and the later calls about the house and Connor. His risk management instincts had finally replaced shock. We dictated a timeline into his phone, not because we expected a custody battle or a lawsuit, but because memory becomes convenient when consequences arrive. At home, Marcus carried Zuri from the car without waking her. I washed the dried blood from the inside of my cheek and photographed the swelling on my face. Then I stood in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. The woman looking back at me did not appear triumphant. She looked tired. Sweet revenge sounds glamorous when people tell the story afterward. In the moment, it often looks like evidence folders, a sleeping child, a husband admitting his family has crossed a line, and a woman deciding she will never again confuse endurance with grace. I went to bed knowing Connor was in custody. Beatrice had lost control of the house, and Chloe was discovering that loyalty to a fraudster has a price. But the most important decision had already been made before any warrant or foreclosure mattered. Marcus and I had walked out together. Whatever came next, nobody was going to split us by appealing to blood status or shame. By the next afternoon, Beatrice no longer had the mansion to use as a stage. The deputies completed the possession process that had been set in motion before Christmas, and Harrison helped move what he could into temporary storage. Beatrice refused to accept that the locks could legally change without her permission. She stood on the sidewalk in a fur-trimmed coat, filming the front doors, and insisting to anyone who would listen that a ruthless corporate raider had stolen her ancestral home. The first live stream appeared before sunset. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat of Harrison's car with her face carefully framed, mascara smudged just enough to suggest grief, without making her look undignified. She spoke directly to the members of First Baptist, where she had served for years as president of the women's ministry. She said she was coming forward because silence protects abusers. Then she called me the abuser. She told viewers that her dark-skinned daughter-in-law had used secret financial tricks to seize a 60-year-old black family's legacy in the middle of winter. She said I had manipulated foreclosure paperwork, weaponized my profession, and ordered deputies to throw two elderly people into the cold on Christmas because I resented their success. She never mentioned the $3 million. She never mentioned Connor. She did not mention the 3 slaps or the words she had used toward Zuri. Instead, she cried into the camera and said she had always tried to welcome me, despite my difficult background and unstable temper. The comments flooded in faster than I could read them. Members of the church posted praying hand emojis and Bible verses about honoring parents. Older women who had watched Beatrice preside over charity luncheons for years called me cruel. Men who knew Harrison from Sunday services asked how a daughter-in-law could shame her elders so publicly. People who had never met me repeated the phrase predatory foreclosure as if they had personally examined the file. By evening, my private number had somehow made its way into a group chat. The calls started. Some people demanded I return the house. Others told me God would punish me for humiliating a respected black matriarch. One woman left a 3-minute voicemail saying women like me became successful and forgot the people who paved the way. I deleted it before the final sentence. Marcus wanted to respond immediately. He paced across our living room with his phone in his hand, furious that his mother was rewriting the night in public. I told him not yet. In restructuring work, the most dangerous thing a person can do during a crisis is react to the first wave of noise before understanding the full exposure. Beatrice had decided to turn reputation into a weapon. If I answered emotionally, I would be fighting on the field she chose. I needed facts arranged in a way that could survive scrutiny. The smear campaign did not stay online. 2 clients called my office the next morning. Neither accused me of wrongdoing, but both used the careful language professionals use when they are nervous. They had seen the live stream. They wanted assurance that Phoenix had followed every lawful step in the acquisition and possession process. One asked whether my personal relationship to the former owner created a conflict that could affect an unrelated restructuring engagement. Another asked whether there was litigation pending. Those questions mattered. My business depended on credibility. I could survive insults about my childhood. I could survive Beatrice calling me trash. What I could not permit was a false narrative that I abused distressed asset procedures for personal revenge. So I opened the file again, not as a daughter-in-law, and not as a woman who had been slapped, but as the executive responsible for every decision bearing my company's name. The acquisition had been reviewed internally. The debt had been priced before I knew Beatrice was still hiding the default from Harrison. The foreclosure process had already advanced by the time I saw the address. My company had the chain of documents, the notices, the purchase approvals, and the possession order. None of that erased the satisfaction I felt when the house became ours, but satisfaction was not the same thing as fraud. Then another piece of information reached my desk. Connor's investor records were being examined as part of the federal case, and several names tied to First Baptist appeared in the materials Phoenix already possessed from the distressed entities we had reviewed. Elderly church members had invested retirement savings in Connor's crypto venture after being introduced through Beatrice's social circle. The same woman live streaming about my lack of ethics had helped place a suspected fraudster in front of people who trusted her religious reputation. I stared at the list for a long time. Marcus came into my office carrying tea and saw my expression. I turned the screen toward him. His face hardened as he read the names. He recognized almost all of them. Then he pointed to one entry near the top. It belonged to the pastor of First Baptist. That changed the strategy. I spent the next several hours building 2 parallel files. The first was for my attorneys and internal compliance team. It contained the complete property timeline, the acquisition approvals, conflict disclosures, foreclosure documents, possession order, and every communication showing. Phoenix had followed the same controls it would have followed for any other distressed asset. The second file was for me as a mother. It contained screenshots of Beatrice's live stream abusive messages, public claims about Zuri, and records of anyone attempting to contact our child through third parties. Those files represented the difference between defense and retaliation. I did not need to ruin Beatrice's reputation. She was doing that herself. My job was to ensure her version of events could not damage my company or reach my daughter unchecked. Marcus offered to post a public statement. I told him one sentence was enough. Our family would not discuss an active financial matter on social media, but any client with questions about Phoenix's conduct could contact counsel directly. No insults, no screenshots of Beatrice slapping me, no dramatic accusations about Connor. We would not compete with her for attention. The restraint frustrated him at first. Then he watched the comments under Beatrice's live stream grow more extreme. People who began by expressing sympathy soon started inventing details she had never claimed. One commenter said I had forged foreclosure records. Another said I had bribed deputies. Someone else insisted Marcus was being financially controlled by his wife. Beatrice liked several of those comments without correcting them. That was useful. It showed me she was not seeking accuracy, she was seeking a crowd. The client calls also became more manageable once our counsel provided the documentation. One client thanked me for answering quickly and said the real concern had been whether personal conflict had bypassed company controls. It had not. Another asked us to continue the engagement as planned. My professional life stopped feeling as though it were sliding toward a cliff. Then I returned to Connor's investor materials. The list from First Baptist was not a weapon I enjoyed holding. These were real people, many of them older, who had trusted a social connection. I highlighted the names, amounts, and dates, then separated what our records actually proved from what remained allegation. I would not stand in a church and claim someone lost money if the accounting had not established that. I would show what was documented: solicitation, transfer, relationship to Connor's venture, and Beatrice's role introducing him. By midnight, the strategy was clear. Beatrice had chosen the sanctuary because she believed moral authority could overwhelm financial evidence. I would go to the same sanctuary and let the evidence ask questions she could not answer. By Saturday afternoon, Beatrice's live stream had been reposted thousands of times in local circles. She announced that she would address the congregation Sunday morning and ask the church to stand with her against financial abuse. She framed the service as a testimony. I knew exactly what she intended. She wanted a sanctuary full of people to bless her version of the story before anyone saw the documents. I closed my laptop and told Marcus we were going to church. Sunday morning. I dressed in a charcoal suit with clean lines and no ornament beyond a small gold pin at the collar. I did not want to look flashy. I wanted to look precise. Marcus wore a dark suit beside me. Zuri stayed safely away from the confrontation. I carried one thick case file containing the property records, Connor's investor schedules, transfer documents, and the materials our counsel had cleared for presentation. I was not walking into First Baptist to argue about who cried harder. I was walking in to show the congregation what their tears had been covering. The sanctuary was already full when we arrived. Beatrice stood near the pulpit in cream-colored clothes, one hand pressed dramatically to her chest. The projection screens behind her displayed a still image from her live stream with the words, "Family under attack." Harrison sat several rows back, shoulders rounded, looking older than he had 3 days earlier. Chloe sat near the front with dark glasses covering her eyes. Connor's chair beside her was empty. Beatrice was speaking when the rear doors opened. Her voice trembled as she told the congregation that greed had entered her family through someone she had tried to love as a daughter. Heads turned toward us. The room changed instantly. The pastor stepped away from his chair and met us in the center aisle. His face was stern. He told me this was a house of worship, not a courtroom, and asked me to leave before I created more division. I did not raise my voice. I told him I respected the sanctuary enough not to accuse anyone without documentation. Then I asked him for 5 minutes and permission to use the projection system. If the records did not directly concern people in his congregation, Marcus and I would leave without another word. Beatrice shouted from the front that I was threatening the church. The pastor looked past me toward her, then back at the thick file in my hands. He hesitated. Finally, he gave a short nod. I walked to the front without looking at Beatrice. A volunteer connected the presentation file from my secure drive to the sanctuary display. I stood beneath the cross and told the congregation that I was not there to defend my feelings. I was there because members of this church had been told a financial story that was incomplete, and some of them were financially connected to the same man at the center of it. The first slide was simple. No dramatic graphics. Just a list of investor names, dates, and amounts tied to Connor's crypto venture. A murmur moved through the room. I advanced to the second page. The pastor stopped breathing. His own name appeared there beside an investment amount large enough to change the expression on his face. Beneath his name were the names of older church members seated throughout the sanctuary. One woman in the third row covered her mouth. An elderly man stood halfway up from his seat and asked why his retirement account was on my screen. Beatrice rushed toward me, saying the list was confidential and probably fabricated. I told the pastor the entries came from records associated with the distressed entities Phoenix had reviewed and documents preserved in the ongoing fraud matter. I did not claim that every investment would be lost. I did not claim every person had been legally defrauded. I said something more careful and more devastating. These were people whose money had been solicited into the same venture Connor was now accused of misrepresenting. The pastor looked directly at Beatrice. He asked whether she had introduced Connor to church members as a trustworthy investment professional. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed. She said Connor had seemed brilliant. She said everyone had been excited about crypto. She said adults made their own investment choices. A woman near the front stood and said, Beatrice had personally told her Connor's opportunity was safer than a certificate of deposit. Another voice said, Beatrice had described him as family and therefore beyond suspicion. The sanctuary erupted in overlapping questions. I did not need to add anything. The room was doing the work for me. The pastor asked me to pause on the investor slide. He walked closer to the screen and read the dates twice. Then he asked whether I was saying Connor had stolen his money. I told him no. I was saying his name appeared in records showing that money moved into Connor's venture after representations tied to that offering. The federal case would determine criminal liability. The restructuring records could show exposure, not replace a verdict. That distinction changed the room. I was not performing certainty. I was showing discipline. Beatrice, by contrast, had spent days speaking in absolutes about my motives without producing a single document. An elderly couple seated near the aisle asked to see the entry connected to them. I enlarged the page. The husband shook his head slowly and said, Beatrice had invited them to a dinner where Connor described the investment as nearly guaranteed. His wife added that they had been told several respected church families were already participating, so they assumed due diligence had been done. A man farther back said he invested because Connor kept repeating that Beatrice would never risk the church's reputation. Another woman said she had declined the opportunity and had been made to feel foolish for being too conservative. Beatrice shouted that everyone was rewriting history because the market turned against Connor. She said no investment is guaranteed and accused the congregation of attacking her because they were embarrassed by their own greed. That accusation cost her more support than anything I could have said. The pastor looked at her with visible disbelief. He reminded her that church leadership had rules against using ministry authority to promote private investments. Beatrice insisted she never used the pulpit. A woman near the choir answered that she did not need the pulpit. She used women's ministry dinners, prayer groups, and her title. Marcus stood beside me without speaking. I could feel how difficult it was for him to watch the mother who raised him lose credibility in public. But he did not step in to rescue her. That mattered. His loyalty to truth was no longer conditional on whether the truth embarrassed his family. I advanced one more page, showing a simple timeline. Introductions, investments. Connor's financial decline, Beatrice's reverse mortgage, the church transfers we had begun to identify, and the foreclosure. I did not connect every dot for the audience. The sequence was enough. The pastor finally turned toward Beatrice and asked the question she had avoided all morning. When did you first know Connor was in financial trouble? She said she did not remember. No one in the sanctuary believed her. Beatrice raised both hands and begged everyone to calm down. She insisted Connor had simply suffered a business setback. She said federal investigators were overreacting and that failed investments were not the same as fraud. Then she pointed at me and tried to drag the attention back toward the house. She said none of this justified what I had done to an elderly woman on Christmas. I looked at her and said she was right about one thing. Connor's investor list was not the only issue. I opened the second section of my file. The sanctuary quieted again. I told the pastor that during Phoenix's review of transfers connected to Connor's venture, my team found a set of payments that did not originate from Beatrice's personal account, Harrison's savings, or the reverse mortgage proceeds. The source account belonged to the First Baptist Women's Ministry Charitable Fund. Beatrice went completely still. I put the bank summary on the screen. $200,000 had moved out of the ministry's charitable account in several transfers and ultimately into an account supporting Connor's failing venture. The fund existed because widows, retirees, working mothers, and church members had donated money for food assistance scholarships, emergency rent, and community care. It was not a private investment pool. It was not Beatrice's inheritance. It was not hers to use to protect a son-in-law from embarrassment. The reaction was immediate. Several women stood at once. One of them shouted that she had spent a year organizing bake sales for that fund. Another said the ministry had denied an emergency housing request 2 months earlier because Beatrice claimed resources were low. A third woman began crying. Beatrice rushed toward the screen and said the money had only been borrowed. She said Connor promised enormous returns, and she intended to put every dollar back before anyone noticed. She insisted she was trying to grow the fund, not steal it. Her explanation made the room angrier. I asked whether the board had authorized the transfers. She did not answer. The pastor asked the same question louder. Beatrice looked toward Chloe for help, but Chloe was staring at the floor. She looked toward Marcus. He folded his arms and gave her nothing. Finally, she looked toward Harrison, expecting the husband who had spent decades swallowing the truth to protect her one more time. Harrison stood. His hands shook as he removed his glasses. He wiped the lenses with a handkerchief even though they were not dirty, buying himself a few seconds of courage. Then he faced the congregation and said the words Beatrice had spent her entire adult life preventing him from saying. "My daughter-in-law is telling the truth." Beatrice made a broken sound and told him to sit down. He did not. Harrison said that after the foreclosure notice appeared, he opened the small safe Beatrice had always treated as private. Inside, he found transfer receipts and printed confirmations showing the women's ministry account sending money into a company associated with Connor. He said he had asked her about unusual withdrawals months earlier, and she told him they were approved charity disbursements. He now understood that was a lie. Beatrice screamed that he was humiliating his wife. Harrison's voice shook, but it grew stronger. He said humiliation was not the problem. The problem was that people had trusted them. He admitted he had spent years staying quiet because confronting Beatrice was exhausting. He had watched her insult me. He had watched her favor Chloe. He had watched her treat Connor like royalty. And on Christmas night, he watched his silence become a shield around behavior he could no longer pretend not to see. The pastor stepped down from the platform and asked 2 church officers to secure the financial records and remove Beatrice's access to the ministry accounts immediately. He said an independent review would begin that afternoon. He also said the church would cooperate with any lawful investigation connected to the transfers. Beatrice's carefully constructed moral authority disappeared in front of hundreds of people. She tried one last time to regain control. She raised her chin and said everyone was forgetting that she had spent decades serving the church. She had organized meals fundraisers, scholarship drives, and holiday programs. She said one desperate financial decision did not erase a lifetime of good works. I told her no one was erasing anything. That was the point. Every good thing she had done remained true. So did every cruel thing. Service did not purchase immunity. Charity did not give her ownership of donated money. A church title did not transform theft into stewardship. And being a grandmother did not give her permission to call a 5-year-old child trash. The final sentence hit harder than anything on the screen. People who had been angry at me only minutes earlier looked toward Beatrice with a different kind of silence. Her live stream had depended on presenting herself as a wounded elder. Now they could see the pattern underneath that image, before truth status, before family appearances, before responsibility. The pastor returned to the microphone and asked the congregation to remain seated while church leaders spoke with Harrison and reviewed the documents. He then looked at me and apologized publicly for asking me to leave before hearing the facts. I accepted the apology without turning it into a victory speech. I had not come there to conquer a pastor. I had come because my professional integrity was being attacked with lies, and because people in that room deserved to know why their money was connected to Connor. As Marcus and I stepped away from the front, Chloe's phone began ringing. The women who managed the ministry fund reacted with a kind of anger that was quieter than shouting and more dangerous. They began asking procedural questions. Who had signed the transfers? Which approvals were recorded? Why had quarterly reports shown less available cash without explaining the outflow? Beatrice tried to answer all of them at once and answered none. I explained that the records I possessed did not establish the church's entire internal control process. That review belonged to the church and were appropriate investigators. What the bank statements did establish was movement of $200,000 from the charity account toward entities connected to Connor. The destination was not a food pantry rent assistance program scholarship recipient or emergency family grant. One woman began crying and said she had personally called Beatrice about a mother whose electricity was scheduled for disconnection. Beatrice had told her the ministry needed to conserve cash. The woman repeated the sentence slowly, as though hearing it for the first time in the context of the transfer records. Harrison's confession deepened the injury because it proved the secrecy had reached inside the marriage. After he confirmed finding the receipts, the pastor asked why he had waited until now. Harrison did not defend himself. He said fear and passivity were not excuses. He had spent years telling himself that keeping Beatrice calm kept the family together. In reality, his silence taught her that someone else would absorb the cost of every decision. Marcus looked at his father for a long moment. No reconciliation happened there, no dramatic embrace. But I saw something shift. Harrison had finally named his weakness without asking Marcus to pretend it had not hurt anyone. Beatrice accused him of betrayal. Harrison answered that truth told late was still better than another lie told on time. The pastor asked the congregation to stop filming. Several phones lowered. He said this was no longer appropriate material for social media entertainment. Real money had been entrusted to the church. Real members might have been harmed, and real investigations would follow. The sanctuary was asked to preserve dignity while refusing secrecy. That sentence stayed with me. Dignity without secrecy. For years, Beatrice had demanded the opposite. She wanted secrecy to preserve dignity. Hide the prejudice. Hide the debt. Hide the failing investment. Hide the missing charity money. Hide the trust. Hide whatever threatened the image. The entire morning was the collapse of that bargain. She looked at the screen and froze. The automated announcement from the detention facility was loud enough that the people nearest us heard it. The call was from Connor. I stopped walking. Chloe's hand shook around the phone. She whispered that she did not want to answer. Marcus told her that ignoring him would not change what he had done. Beatrice, still standing near the pulpit with her face streaked by tears, suddenly rushed toward Chloe and ordered her to pick up. She said Connor needed them. She said this was not the time to abandon family. Chloe answered. The recorded system asked whether she would accept the call. She pressed the key. Connor's voice came through, hard, impatient, and completely stripped of the polished startup language he used at family dinners. I demanded to know why no one had posted money for his release. Chloe started crying and told him the court had not granted the easy bond he expected because prosecutors described him as a flight risk. She said Marcus refused to move money for the defense. She told him the church had just seen the investor list and the charity transfers. Connor exploded. He cursed Chloe first. Then he cursed Beatrice. He said they were useless. He said he had married into the family because Beatrice's obsession with status made her easy to manipulate, and because her church connections gave him access to investors who trusted a familiar black family. The words became uglier as his panic rose. He used racist slurs. He mocked the way Beatrice talked about black excellence and said he had never believed any of it. He said the family had been useful because they made perfect diversity tokens for pitch decks and investor dinners. He claimed people were less suspicious of a white founder selling risky crypto when a respected black family stood beside him and vouched for his character. The sanctuary went silent enough to hear the faint electrical hum from the speakers. Chloe stared at the phone as though it had turned into something poisonous in her hand. She asked whether he had ever loved her. Connor laughed. It was not nervous laughter. It was contempt. He told her love had nothing to do with marriage when money was involved. He said she liked the lifestyle, he liked the access, and both of them got what they wanted, until her family ruined it. Then he demanded she find another attorney and stop crying. Chloe's knees gave out. She sank onto the end of a pew, one hand pressed over her mouth. For years she had sided with Connor when he made jokes about my neighborhood, my skin, my education, my daughter. She had repeated his language because proximity to him made her feel elevated. Now in front of the community she had tried to impress, she heard exactly what he thought of her. Beatrice reached for the phone. Connor heard her voice and became even more vicious. He called her gullible. He said the only reason he tolerated her endless talk about elite bloodlines was because she signed whatever he put in front of her when he flattered her. He told her the $3 million was gone. He said the church money was gone. He said if she had been smarter, she would have protected herself instead of trying so hard to prove she belonged beside wealthy white people. Beatrice looked as if someone had struck her. I remembered the 3 slaps on my face. I did not enjoy watching her hear those words. What I felt was colder than enjoyment. Recognition. She had spent years placing whiteness, light skin, and social approval above the people who loved her. Connor had simply used the hierarchy she built and placed himself at the top of it. The pastor told Chloe to end the call. She did not move. Marcus stepped forward gently, took the phone from her hand and pressed the button. Connor disappeared mid-curse. Chloe bent forward and began sobbing. She apologized to Marcus. Then she looked at me and tried to speak, but no words came. I did not rescue her from that silence. An apology spoken only because the person you worshipped finally humiliated you is not the same thing as accountability. Beatrice sat down in the front pew, suddenly looking much smaller than she had on Christmas night. Harrison remained standing several feet away from her. He did not touch her. For once, he did not move to absorb the consequences of her choices. Marcus took my hand. We walked out of First Baptist together, leaving Beatrice, Chloe, and the wreckage of Connor's truth behind us. After Marcus ended Connor's call, Chloe remained seated with both hands covering her face. Nobody rushed to reassure her. The silence around her was not cruelty. It was the first space she had ever been forced to occupy without someone immediately converting her pain into innocence. She looked at me and said she did not know Connor felt that way about black people. I asked whether she had ever noticed the way he imitated AAVE at family dinners, changing his voice when he wanted to entertain his white friends or sound closer to Marcus. She said she thought he was being funny. I asked whether she noticed how often his jokes depended on a black person being the punchline. She said everyone laughed. I told her that was exactly the problem. Connor had not hidden every part of himself. He had tested the room in small doses. The family rewarded him because Beatrice had already decided his whiteness and supposed wealth were proof of value. Chloe defended him because defending him protected the identity she had chosen. The racist contempt on the jail call was uglier and more explicit, but it did not come from nowhere. Chloe whispered that she had betrayed her own brother for a man who saw her as a marketing strategy. Marcus answered quietly, "You also betrayed your niece." She began crying again. Beatrice still tried to separate Connor's words from her own choices. She said he had manipulated all of them. I agreed that he had manipulated them. Then I told her manipulation works best when it attaches itself to a desire already present. Connor did not invent her colorism. He did not invent her obsession with elite approval. He merely learned how to feed both. The pastor asked Beatrice to leave the front area of the sanctuary while church leaders secured records. She resisted at first, saying she had served there longer than some of the people questioning her. Harrison told her service length did not confer ownership. Eventually, she walked toward a side room, shoulders stiff, refusing to look at the women whose charity account had funded Connor. Chloe stayed on the pew. When Marcus and I finally turned toward the doors, she called his name. He stopped, but did not go back. She said she was sorry. Marcus told her he hoped that someday she would understand what she was sorry for. Then we left. We left First Baptist expecting at least for one evening silence. We did not get it. Harrison called before we reached home. He was not frantic this time. His voice was exhausted, scraped down to something honest. He said Beatrice had been asked to surrender every ministry key password checkbook and financial record she controlled. Church leaders were already preserving the account history. She had spent 20 minutes insisting the transfers were temporary investments made for the good of the ministry, then shifted without warning into another demand. She wanted Marcus to give her what she called her share of the family inheritance so she could hire lawyers before the church and federal investigators froze everything. Marcus put the call on speaker. He asked what inheritance she was talking about. Harrison went quiet. That silence was different from his usual cowardice. It sounded like a man standing at the edge of one final secret. He asked whether we could meet him privately the next morning. Marcus said no more hidden meetings, no more mysteries, no more protecting Beatrice from embarrassment. Harrison answered that this was not about protecting her. It was about Zuri. The next morning he arrived at our house carrying no luggage and wearing the same dark coat he had worn to church. He looked as if he had aged a decade in 1 week. Zuri was in the next room drawing at the kitchen table, safe and occupied. Harrison asked us to sit in my office. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a tiny brass key on my desk. I did not touch it. Marcus asked what it opened. Harrison said his mother's safe deposit box. Marcus's grandmother had died several years earlier. She had been the one person in that family who never treated me like a social experiment. She grew up during a time when opportunities for Black women were even narrower than the ones I faced, and she respected education more than status. She met Zuri only a handful of times before her health failed, but every time she saw that little girl she asked about books, preschool, and what she liked to draw. According to Harrison, she worried about the way Beatrice talked about inheritance, as though family money existed to purchase admiration. A few months before her death, she created an education trust for Zuri, $250,000. The number landed with a strange weight. It was not enormous compared with the distressed assets I handled professionally, but this money was different. It was not corporate capital, it was intention. A great-grandmother had set aside $250,000 for one child because she wanted that child to have choices. Marcus stared at his father. He asked why he had never heard of it. Harrison looked down at his hands. He said Beatrice had served as executor of the estate and controlled the flow of documents after the funeral. She told him the estate was simpler than everyone expected, and that most remaining assets had been distributed according to old beneficiary designations. He believed her. Months later, he found one reference to an education trust in a tax folder. When he asked Beatrice, she said the trust had never been funded and the paperwork was obsolete. I did not challenge her. Then after the foreclosure exploded and he opened the safe, he found copies of the actual trust instrument funding confirmation and correspondence showing the account had been established for Zuri. Beatrice had hidden the file. She had redirected statements away from the family mail. She had also kept the safe deposit box key with documents she clearly never intended Marcus to see. I finally picked up the key. My first reaction was not excitement. It was fury. Beatrice had not simply insulted my daughter because of a drawing. She had not simply called her trash because she looked too much like me. She had looked at that child for years while knowing another woman in the family had deliberately protected Zuri's future. Every Christmas gift, every birthday, every lecture about legacy had happened under the shadow of a trust she pretended did not exist. Marcus stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. He asked his father whether any money had been taken. Harrison said he did not know. The trust documents restricted distributions to education and related needs, but Beatrice had been trying to obtain access. He found handwritten notes in the file referencing a vehicle purchase and Connor's name. That did not prove she had successfully removed the principal. It proved she had been looking for a way to use money that was never meant for her. I appreciated that distinction. Anger does not excuse sloppy conclusions. We needed the trust records, the account history, and the governing document before accusing anyone of taking $1. We drove to the bank that afternoon with the key and the estate documents Harrison had recovered. Through counsel and the procedures available to the beneficiary's parents, we verified the trust still existed. The principal had not been emptied. That fact should have relieved me. Instead, what I saw in the correspondence made my hands go cold. Beatrice had repeatedly asked whether the trust could make an early distribution for what she described as a family investment benefiting Zuri's future. The requests were rejected because they did not fit the educational purpose. In another note, she asked whether a luxury vehicle could qualify if it were used to transport the child. The description of the requested vehicle matched the kind of supercar Connor had been bragging about ordering before his arrest. She had tried to bend a child's education fund into another accessory for the adults she wanted to impress. Marcus read the copies beside me. His face became completely still. Harrison said. Beatrice was staying at a cheap extended stay property while the church review and financial investigation moved forward. She had refused to go anywhere near him because she blamed him for speaking at First Baptist. Marcus asked whether his father intended to return to her. Harrison said he did not know what his marriage would become, but he knew he was finished lying for her. I placed the trust file inside my briefcase. I told Marcus we were going to see his mother. Before leaving the bank, I requested certified copies of every document we were entitled to receive on Zuri's behalf. I wanted no family summary, no verbal assurance, no selective page. Beatrice could later claim we misunderstood. The trust instrument identified the beneficiary, educational purpose restrictions, and succession provisions. The funding confirmation proved the $250,000 had actually been transferred. The rejected requests documented Beatrice's attempts to stretch the meaning of education until it could cover expenses that benefited adults. Marcus read the pages again in the parking lot. He said his grandmother had once told him that money reveals character because it gives people the ability to act on what they already value. At the time, he thought she was talking about saving. Now he wondered whether she had been warning him about his mother. I reminded him we could not know what a dead woman intended beyond the documents she left. That mattered to me. Families are experts at turning deceased relatives into imaginary witnesses who always agree with whoever is speaking. The trust itself was enough. His grandmother had written down what she wanted. Zuri's education. Not Connor's car. Not Chloe's image. Not Beatrice's approval. That evening, Zuri asked why Daddy looked sad. Marcus sat on the floor beside her art table and said he had learned Grandma kept a secret that should not have been kept. Zuri asked whether it was a bad secret. He told her yes, but that the grown-ups were fixing it. She considered this, then handed him a purple marker. "Draw something happy," she said. Marcus laughed despite himself and drew a terrible-looking flower. Zuri informed him it looked like a spider wearing a hat. For 5 minutes, the trust, the court case, and Christmas disappeared. Watching them reminded me why the documents mattered. The $250,000 was valuable, but the greater task was making sure Zuri never learned to measure herself by it. Beatrice had treated wealth as proof of superiority. I wanted the trust to become what it was designed to be: quiet protection in the background of a child's life. The next morning, I placed the certified file in my briefcase. We were not going to the motel to fight over money. We were going because Beatrice had tried to turn a child's future into another tool for adults, and Marcus deserved to hear her explain why. The motel sat beside a 6-lane commercial road, far from the manicured streets of Buckhead. Beatrice had spent decades choosing restaurants based on valet service and refusing to enter stores without marble floors. Now she was living behind a flickering sign with an ice machine rattling outside her door and traffic shaking the windows every few minutes. She opened the door wearing a plain sweater and no makeup. For half a second, she looked like an ordinary, tired 60-year-old woman. Then she saw me, and the old hatred returned to her eyes. She asked what I wanted. Marcus stepped inside behind me. He did not hug her. He did not call her mom. I placed the trust documents on the small laminate table beside the motel coffee maker. Beatrice's face changed immediately. I asked her why she hid a $250,000 education trust from her own son. She said it was none of my business. I reminded her that Zuri was my daughter and the beneficiary. Then I asked the question that had been living inside me since Christmas dinner. Why did you hate a 5-year-old child enough to point at her and call her trash? Beatrice looked toward Marcus, expecting him to interrupt. He simply folded his arms. I asked again, Why slap me in front of her? Why throw her into the cold? Why hide money meant for her education? What had that little girl ever done to you? Beatrice told me to stop performing. She said this was exactly what she hated about me, the way I acted morally superior, because I had a degree and a company. I told her my company had nothing to do with the question. Her restraint snapped. She said Zuri looked too much like me. The sentence was quiet at first. Then everything she had spent years disguising as etiquette came pouring out. She said when Zuri was born, she expected the child to carry more of Marcus's lighter features. Instead, Zuri had my deep brown skin, my wide smile, my eyes, and the same thick curls Beatrice had spent years calling difficult. She said people in her social circle noticed. She claimed they made comments about how strong my side of the family was. She said she had wanted a granddaughter who looked refined, light, delicate, and unmistakably connected to what she called their old Atlanta lineage. Marcus flinched as though she had struck him. Beatrice kept going because rage had finally freed her from pretending. She said Chloe had always understood presentation. Chloe married Connor, brought a white man with technology connections into the family, and knew how to move in rooms where appearances mattered. I, according to Beatrice, had dragged Marcus backward into the same working-class darkness she believed he had escaped. And Zuri was the visible proof of that choice. I looked at her and understood something that made the entire conflict uglier and simpler. Beatrice had not been protecting tradition. She had been protecting a hierarchy. She believed lighter was better, richer was better, whiter approval was better, and anyone who challenged that ladder threatened the identity she had built. I tapped the education trust documents. I asked about the request to use Zuri's fund for a vehicle. Beatrice did not deny them. She shouted that the money would have stayed in the family. She said Connor needed a high-end car to meet investors, and Chloe needed to maintain appearances beside him. If Connor's company succeeded, everyone would benefit, including Zuri. She insisted that using the trust to help them would have been an investment in the child's future. Marcus stared at his mother in disbelief. He asked if she could hear herself. She was describing taking school money from a kindergartner to buy a supercar for two adults who mocked that same child. Beatrice snapped that Zuri had 20 years before college and could earn scholarships like I did. Connor needed the money now. That sentence ended whatever remained between Marcus and his mother. He stepped closer to the table and told her she had spent his entire life teaching him that family legacy meant protecting the next generation. Now he understood she only meant protecting the people who made her look important. Zuri was family when Beatrice wanted photographs. She was disposable when her skin and face disrupted the image. A hard knock hit the motel door. Beatrice froze. Another knock followed, louder. A voice outside identified law enforcement and asked her to open the door. She looked at me with immediate accusation. I had not called anyone from the motel. I did not need to. The church transfers Connor's federal case, the mortgage records, and the financial trail were already moving through investigators who did not care about our family schedule. Marcus opened the door. Officers stood outside with paperwork relating to the ongoing fraud investigation. They informed Beatrice that investigators had developed evidence connecting her to transfers used to support Connor's fraudulent operation and that she was being taken into custody for processing and questioning under the warrant. They did not discuss the case in the hallway. They did not argue about her church service. They simply told her to bring identification and step outside. Beatrice began crying. She told Marcus to stop them. She said she was his mother. He answered in the same calm voice he had used on Christmas night. "You were Zuri's grandmother." Beatrice looked at me as the officers guided her towards the walkway. For the first time since I had known her, she had no audience she could control. No pearls, no mansion, no church title, no Connor. Just paperwork and consequences. I gathered the education trust documents from the motel table and held them against my chest. The money belonged to Zuri. The shame belonged to Beatrice. I did not answer Beatrice's colorist confession immediately. I let the motel room become quiet enough for her to hear the ugliness of her own words without my reaction competing with them. Then I told her what she had failed to understand about Zuri. My daughter did not need to become lighter, quieter, richer, or more socially acceptable to deserve protection. Her face was not a family problem to be corrected. Her skin was not evidence that Marcus married beneath himself. Her curls were not an embarrassment. Her drawing did not become trash because a white man laughed at it. Zuri's existence required nothing from Beatrice except the basic humanity a grandmother should have offered without negotiation. Beatrice rolled her eyes and said I was turning preferences into racism. Marcus answered before I could. He told her preferring a paint color is a preference, ranking your granddaughter's beauty and worth according to how light she is, then praising a white son-in-law while demeaning the child's dark-skinned mother is colorism and prejudice, no matter how politely you phrase it. Beatrice told him I had poisoned him against his family. Marcus said no. Watching her hit me did that. I opened the page containing Beatrice's request to treat a luxury vehicle as a permissible trust expense. I placed it directly in front of her. She stared at her own signature. I asked her to imagine Zuri at 18 opening a college acceptance letter and learning the education money her great-grandmother protected had been turned into a car. Connor and Chloe drove to parties. Beatrice said they would have paid it back after Connor's company succeeded. I asked what part of Connor's current federal detention made that plan sound responsible. She had no answer. Marcus told her the trust would now be protected by professionals with no ability for her to interfere. She would receive no statements, no keys, no discretionary access, and no opportunity to redefine Zuri's education as a family emergency. Beatrice looked at him as if he had disowned her all over again. Maybe he had. The knock at the door came moments later. 1 month later, I walked into federal court, wearing the same kind of dark suit I wore to difficult corporate liquidations. There is a particular stillness in a courtroom where money is being traced. People arrive carrying stories about love, innocence, ignorance, and misunderstanding. The court looks for ownership transfers, precedes signatures, and proof. The hearing concerned assets connected to Connor's fraud and the claims of people seeking restitution. My company had been appointed to assist with the liquidation and tracing of certain distressed assets we had acquired or administered. I was not there as a woman taking revenge on relatives. I was there in a professional capacity, with records that had been reviewed by counsel. Chloe sat several rows away. I almost did not recognize her. The polished woman who once laughed at Zuri's painting had lost the carefully maintained surface that used to enter rooms before she did. Her hair was pulled back without styling. She wore a plain coat. Her face looked thinner, and the expensive handbag that had once seemed permanently attached to her arm was gone. She kept looking toward Marcus, who sat beside me. Before the hearing began, Chloe approached us. She asked Marcus if they could speak privately. He said anything she needed to say could be said with me present. Her eyes filled with tears. She told him she had lost everything because of Connor. She said creditors were taking furniture, accounts were frozen, and people who once begged for invitations to her parties no longer answered her calls. She asked him to tell the court that she had not understood where the money came from. Marcus asked whether she understood where the cruelty came from when she laughed at his daughter. Chloe looked down. She said she was sorry. Marcus told her remorse did not become more convincing because the designer labels disappeared. Then he stepped away before she could turn her desperation into another negotiation. Inside the courtroom, Connor's defense attorney tried to build exactly the escape route I expected. He did not deny that investor funds had been misused. He did not deny the disastrous transfers. Instead, he portrayed Connor as a reckless founder whose mother-in-law had taken control of financial decisions because she was obsessed with maintaining appearances. He suggested Beatrice had pressured Connor to accept church money, encouraged him to keep raising funds after the venture was failing, and moved charitable assets without his full knowledge. Beatrice sat at another table and stared at Connor as if she had never seen him before. The man she once introduced as a genius was now allowing his attorney to describe her as the controlling force behind the very scheme that had made him look successful. Every compliment, every dinner, every defense she offered him was being repackaged into evidence that she was responsible for his choices. Her attorney objected repeatedly. The judge reminded everyone that blame shifting would not replace tracing evidence. That was where my file mattered. When I was called to present the liquidation records, I explained the chain of purchases tied to accounts receiving fraud proceeds. I did not exaggerate. Some assets were plainly personal property bought with legitimate money and were outside my report. Others had direct transactional links to investor funds, church transfers, or entities used in Connor's scheme. The list included luxury jewelry held in Chloe's name, designer collections purchased during the period when investor money was being diverted, and several high-value items she had shown online as proof of her husband's success. The records did not care that the items were gifts. If the purchase money could be traced to fraud proceeds, the ownership story became much less romantic. Chloe began crying before I finished. Her attorney argued she had been an innocent spouse who received presents without knowing the source. The court considered that claim item by item. I did not ask the judge to strip her of everything she had ever owned. I presented only what the records supported. The judge ultimately ordered the seizure and turnover of the traced luxury assets for the restitution process. The jewelry, high-end bags, watches, and other items linked to the tainted funds would be sold with proceeds directed toward victims under the court's orders. Chloe stood as the decision was read and whispered no over and over. She said those things were her life. I thought of Zuri's painting held between Connor's fingers as if it were contaminated. Those things were never a life, they were props. Beatrice looked toward Connor after the ruling, waiting for some sign that he would defend Chloe or acknowledge the family that had sacrificed so much for him. He did neither. He leaned towards his lawyer and continued discussing his own exposure. That was the moment Beatrice finally understood the transaction she had mistaken for love. She had spent years elevating Connor above her son, her daughter-in-law, and her granddaughter because she believed he brought prestige. Now, with his freedom at stake, he was willing to push every ounce of blame onto her and watch Chloe lose the material symbols of their marriage if it improved his position by even an inch. Outside the courtroom, Beatrice tried to speak to Marcus. He kept walking. Chloe followed us into the corridor and begged again. She asked Marcus to help her rent an apartment. She said she had no one. He told her to contact her attorney and the resources available through the court. She accused him of being cold. Marcus stopped. He said Cold was watching a 5-year-old cry while her uncle mocked her skin and her grandmother called her trash. Cold was laughing beside the people doing it. Boundaries were not cruelty, just because the person outside the boundary disliked the temperature. We left the courthouse together. The asset tracing portion of the hearing lasted longer than Chloe expected because each item required a chain, not a moral judgment. A photograph of someone wearing a necklace did not prove fraud. A purchase receipt alone did not prove tainted funds. My team matched dates, merchant records, account movements, and the entities from which payments originated. When the chain broke, I said so. When the chain held, I showed it. That method frustrated Connor's attorney. He wanted a broader story in which Beatrice was the manipulative matriarch who directed all family spending. Beatrice's lawyer wanted the opposite story. Connor was a sophisticated fraudster who exploited an older woman's vanity. Chloe's lawyer wanted her to disappear between the two narratives as an innocent recipient. The judge repeatedly returned everyone to the same question: what does the record prove about this asset? That question stripped away theater. One designer watch had been bought from an account funded directly by investor transfers. A set of jewelry came from another entity through which Connor routed money during the period covered by the fraud allegations. Several bags were harder to trace and were excluded from the requested turnover. I did not object. My job was not to maximize Chloe's pain. My job was to identify property the legal records supported recovering for victims. Beatrice watched Connor's lawyer use her own emails against her. Messages where she encouraged him to keep appearances strong were presented as proof. She pushed continued fundraising. Notes about church introductions were framed as evidence she expanded his access to investors. Each time her name appeared, Connor sat still and let the blame move toward her. At one point she whispered his name across the aisle. He did not turn around. That indifference wounded her more visibly than the judge's questions. When the turnover order was finally entered, the courtroom did not erupt. There was only the scrape of chairs and Chloe's quiet crying. The luxury items she had treated as evidence of success were now reduced to line items in a restitution inventory. I closed my file. There is something brutally democratic about liquidation. A diamond does not care who wore it. A handbag does not care who posed with it. Once an asset is traced to money that should be returned to victims, social meaning gives way to value at sale. I thought that would be the last direct confrontation with Chloe. It was not. 3 days later, I was in my office reviewing a restructuring proposal when voices rose beyond the glass doors. At first, I ignored them. My staff handled angry creditors, frightened executives, and people who believed volume could change a contract. Then I heard Chloe scream my name. The door burst open before security could stop her. She looked worse than she had in court. Her coat was unbuttoned, her hair disordered, and her face was streaked with tears. She marched straight toward my desk, slamming both palms against the wood. "Give me my life back," she screamed. I remained seated. She accused me of taking her house, her husband, her jewelry, her friends, and her future. She said every door in Atlanta closed because I could not let go of one Christmas argument. She demanded that I call the court, withdraw claims, tell investors Connor had made mistakes but was not a monster, and give her enough money to start over somewhere no one knew her name. I asked whether she truly believed I had taken Connor from her. She screamed that I exposed him. I told her exposure was not creation. I did not write his investor documents. I did not transfer church funds. I did not marry him. I did not laugh when he mocked Zuri. I did not tell Beatrice to choose him over her granddaughter. Chloe had spent years treating consequences as something that happened only to other people. Now that the consequences had crossed her front door, she wanted them reassigned. Security entered behind her, but I raised one hand and told them to wait. The glass conference room door beside my office opened. Marcus stepped out. He had been meeting with me about the trust and Zuri's financial protections. The moment Chloe saw him, she abandoned me and rushed toward her brother. She grabbed his sleeve and begged him to make me stop. She said she was still his sister. She reminded him of childhood Christmases, school pickups, family vacations, every memory she could turn into currency. Marcus gently removed her hand. I told her blood did not erase choice. Chloe shook her head and said, "Family forgives." Marcus said forgiveness was not the same as access. Then his voice became colder than I had ever heard it. "There is no forgiveness called blood when you choose to protect a fraudster and stand there while our mother hits my wife and humiliates my daughter. You watched Zuri cry. You laughed before she cried. You defended the man who caused it. You do not get to invoke childhood now because adulthood finally became expensive." Chloe's face collapsed. Marcus continued. He said he hoped she eventually became a better person. He hoped she learned to live without worshiping status. He hoped she found work, built something honest, and understood why the family had broken. But she would do all of that away from Zuri. She would not come to our house. She would not call our daughter. She would not use relatives, church members' gifts, emergencies, or apologies to force contact. Then he looked at security. "Please escort her out." Chloe screamed his name as 2 guards guided her toward the door. She tried to twist around and tell him he would regret this when their parents died. Marcus did not move. He stood beside my desk and watched until the elevator doors closed behind her. When the office became quiet, he sat down across from me and covered his face with both hands. I knew that moment hurt him. Boundaries can be necessary and still feel like grief. I did not celebrate. I moved around the desk and sat beside him. Marcus said he kept replaying the Christmas dinner and wondering how many times before that night he had tolerated smaller versions of the same cruelty because confronting his mother felt exhausting. He said he loved Chloe once without conditions, and some part of him probably always would. But loving someone did not require handing them a key to his child's life. I took his hand. We made the boundary formal and simple. No visits, no direct contact with Zuri, no use of school, childcare, church, or extended family to reach her. If circumstances changed years from now, we would decide based on conduct, not pressure. Until then, our daughter would not be used as a testing ground for anybody's redemption. For the first time since Christmas, I felt the crisis begin to move out of our home and into the systems built to handle it. Courts could handle Connor. Investigators could handle Beatrice. Creditors could handle the money. Chloe could handle the consequences of her own decisions. Marcus and I had one job left. Protect the child who had never asked for any of it. After Chloe was removed from the office, my security team asked whether I wanted her permanently trespassed from every Phoenix property. I told them to document the incident, restrict her access to my workplace, and route any future communication through counsel. I did not need another public confrontation. A boundary works best when it becomes boring. Marcus sat beside me for nearly half an hour without speaking. Then he admitted he hated how easy the final sentence sounded. "You are no longer my sister." In reality, nothing about it felt easy. Chloe had been the little girl who followed him around the neighborhood, the teenager he drove to school, the person he once assumed would be part of every holiday until they were old. I told him grief did not mean the boundary was wrong. He said he understood. What hurt was recognizing that the sister he remembered and the adult in the elevator were the same person across time. There had been no single moment when she transformed into someone cruel. There were hundreds of small choices, many of which he excused because family was supposed to remain close. That was why we wrote our rules down. Not a legal contract, a family policy for ourselves. Zuri would never be required to hug, speak to, or forgive someone because of a title. Any adult who insulted her identity lost access immediately. Apologies would be measured by changed behavior over time, not tears after consequences. Marcus and I would tell each other when relatives crossed a line instead of privately absorbing it to keep holidays peaceful. I added one rule of my own: our success would not become a new hierarchy. I had no interest in teaching Zuri that we were better than Beatrice because Phoenix owned more property or because Connor went to prison. Money had given me tools. It did not make me morally superior by itself. The victory was using those tools without becoming the kind of person who needed another human being beneath me. Marcus looked toward the elevator where Chloe had disappeared. He said that might be the hardest lesson his family never learned. Then we returned to the trust documents on my conference table. Boundaries were not the end of the work. They were the space in which better work could finally begin. The legal work outlasted the public drama. Headlines moved on before title records did. People stopped reposting Beatrice's livestream long before the final signatures cleared. That was fine with me. Real rebuilding is quieter than destruction. Phoenix Commercial Holdings completed the remaining ownership work on the Buckhead Mansion through the same disciplined process we used for every distressed asset. Liens were reconciled, title issues were resolved, the possession file was closed, and every document was reviewed until there was no uncertainty about who controlled the property. By the time spring approached, the estate that Beatrice had once treated as a throne belonged permanently to my company. Everyone assumed I would sell it. The numbers made that choice obvious. The house sat on valuable land in one of Atlanta's most desirable neighborhoods. A clean sale would have produced an excellent return. My finance team presented the projections. Brokers called before we ever listed it. One developer offered enough money to make even me pause. I declined. Marcus asked whether I was sure. We stood together in the empty dining room where the entire story had started. The wall where his wine glass shattered had been repaired. Beatrice's enormous portrait still hung above the fireplace, watching the room with the same manufactured dignity she had carried in life. The long table was gone. The chandeliers were covered for renovation. Without people inside it, the mansion looked less like a legacy and more like what it had always been: a building. I told Marcus I did not want to preserve his mother's version of the house, and I did not want to profit from it by simply handing it to another wealthy family. I wanted to change what the address meant. Years earlier, when I was a dark-skinned girl from a working-class neighborhood filling out scholarship applications at a library table, I had learned how many talented girls never make it past the first locked door. Some lack tuition, some lack mentors. Some live in homes where ambition is treated like arrogance. Some are told directly or indirectly that their hair-skin neighborhood accent or parents make them less suitable for the rooms where decisions are made. I had survived because a scholarship opened one door and because I learned to force open the next ones myself. I wanted the mansion to become a place that opened doors on purpose. Phoenix created a charitable foundation focused on women and girls of color from working-class backgrounds. We designed programs around education support, career mentoring, financial literacy, entrepreneurship, and emergency assistance for families trying to keep daughters in school. The estate would become the foundation's headquarters and community training center. I did not name it after myself. I did not name it after Beatrice either. The point was not to replace one giant portrait with another. The point was to create a place where no girl's value depended on being close to a powerful last name. Renovation started almost immediately. The first thing I removed was Beatrice's portrait. Workers lowered the massive frame from the wall while Marcus watched from the foyer. He did not smile. He did not look sad. He simply said the wall seemed bigger without her there. We removed the gold-plated decorative pieces that served no purpose beyond display. We cleared closets packed with old event banners celebrating elite membership organizations. We replaced a formal sitting room no child had been allowed to touch with a bright reading library. The wine storage room became a small technology lab. 2 unused guest suites were converted into counseling and mentoring rooms. The enormous dining room where Zuri had once cried into my skirt became a flexible workshop space with movable tables, whiteboards, and enough outlets for laptops. I insisted the renovation keep the house's beautiful bones. I was not trying to erase history. I was trying to change its direction. Harrison came by once during construction. He stood in the foyer for a long time listening to drills and hammers echo through the halls. He told Marcus that his own father would probably have hated the noise. Then he smiled faintly and said his grandmother would have loved what the place was becoming. He asked if there was anything he could do. I gave him a box of old family papers that had been found in a storage cabinet and told him to decide what was personal history and what could be archived. It was not forgiveness for years of silence. It was a task. Harrison seemed to understand the difference. He had begun attending counseling and meetings separately with church leaders about the financial damage Beatrice caused. He no longer asked us to make peace. That alone was progress. Zuri saw the mansion again only after the worst of the construction was over. Marcus and I debated whether bringing her back would confuse her. She remembered Christmas night. Children do not always remember events in neat timelines, but they remember fear. She remembered the loud crack of the slaps. She remembered her grandmother pointing. She remembered Connor laughing at her picture. So before we drove there, we explained that the house was different now. The people who hurt her would not be inside. The building did not belong to them. It was becoming a place where girls could learn and draw and ask questions without being laughed at. Zuri was quiet when we entered the foyer. She held my hand with one hand and Marcus's with the other. She looked toward the wall where Beatrice's portrait used to hang. The blank space had been primed but not painted. Then she looked at me and asked whether Grandma was coming back. I said no. She asked whether Uncle Connor would be there. Marcus said no. Zuri nodded once and walked farther inside. In the new art room, she found a table covered with colored pencils and paper samples. Within 10 minutes, she was drawing. Children can carry pain, but they can also reclaim space faster than adults when they feel safe. Watching her color at a table inside the same house where her art had been mocked felt more meaningful than any courtroom order. The Foundation's first scholarship committee met there a month later. I sat at the end of a long table with educators, business mentors, and community professionals reviewing applications from girls who reminded me of myself at 16. I did not tell them my entire family story. They did not need it. I told them the foundation existed because talent is common and access is not. The foundation's design process forced me to decide what rebuilding actually meant. It would have been easy to create a beautiful program brochure, hold a gala, and use the mansion as another status symbol with more acceptable language. I refused. Every room needed a purpose. Every program needed measurable outcomes, and every dollar needed controls strong enough that no future leader could treat charitable money the way Beatrice had treated the church fund. We built approval rules that required multiple signatures for major transfers. Scholarship decisions were documented. Conflict disclosures were mandatory. The foundation would publish annual impact reports and independent financial reviews. I had seen too many organizations begin with sincere intentions and become dependent on one charismatic person. If the mission could not survive me, then I had only built another throne. Marcus helped review the family engagement policies. He insisted that no donor receive special access to scholarship decisions. No board member could reserve programs for friends, and no child would ever be displayed as a prop for fundraising without consent from a parent or guardian. Those rules may have sounded technical, but to us, they were personal. We knew exactly what happens when image becomes more important than people. On the day the first permanent sign was installed outside the estate, Zuri asked what the word foundation meant. I told her it could mean the part of a building that holds everything up, and it could also mean an organization that helps people build something stronger. She thought for a moment and said both meanings sounded the same. She was right. The opening week proved whether the idea could survive outside a planning document. We refused to stage a black tie launch. Instead, the first public day began on a Saturday morning with folding signs at the driveway, volunteers checking families in, and every workshop room already in use. Girls who had never stepped inside a Buckhead mansion walked through the same front doors Beatrice once guarded as symbols of rank. Nobody asked what neighborhood they came from before giving them a seat. In the former formal parlor, a financial literacy session explained credit savings student aid and the difference between owning an asset and performing wealth for an audience. I listened from the back and almost laughed at the precision of that lesson inside Beatrice's old house. In the technology room, students tested laptops and worked through basic coding exercises. In the renovated library, mothers met with advisors about scholarship applications, while younger children drew at low tables covered with paper. The art room mattered most to Zuri. She had insisted on choosing one wall color and took the responsibility so seriously that she carried paint samples around for a week. On opening day, she sat at a table with other children and drew without asking whether her lines were too messy. Every time I passed the doorway, I remembered Connor holding her Christmas picture with 2 fingers and making it a joke. Now no adult in the room treated creativity as evidence of class. Marcus spent most of the day moving chairs, answering practical questions, and fixing a printer that refused to cooperate. He could have introduced himself as a financial risk professional or as the son of the family that once owned the estate. He did neither. When someone asked who he was, he said he was helping his wife and daughter get the place ready. That answer told me more about how far he had come than any speech could have. At the end of the day, my staff gave me the first attendance report. The numbers were modest. That pleased me. We were not trying to manufacture a viral opening. We were testing whether the programs worked, whether families returned, and whether the resources actually reached people. I asked for feedback forms, budget variance reports, and follow-up calls with participants. A foundation built from the ruins of financial vanity had no excuse to become careless with money. When the last family left, Zuri wandered into the foyer holding a new drawing. She had drawn the mansion with dozens of people inside and tiny colored windows across the front. She asked if we could hang it somewhere too. I told her we would find a place, but not because every picture needed to become a monument. She smiled and said she knew. She just wanted the building to look happy. That was the first time I heard anyone describe the old mansion that way. The first group of recipients included students interested in engineering, nursing design, finance teaching, and entrepreneurship. Their backgrounds varied, but many of their essays shared the same sentence in different forms. Someone had told them they were not the kind of person who belonged in the future they wanted. I knew that sentence intimately. We funded them anyway. The mansion changed with every program. Saturday mornings brought girls carrying backpacks through the front doors. Weekday evenings brought mothers attending financial workshops while their children worked on homework nearby. A room once used for Beatrice's invitation, only wine tastings hosted free college application clinics. The grand staircase that had existed mainly as a backdrop for photographs became noisy with sneakers. I loved the noise. Marcus did too. One evening after the last workshop ended, we stood in the foyer while staff turned off lights. He put his arm around me and said his mother had spent her life talking about legacy and had no idea what the word meant. I told him legacy was not what people were forced to admire while you were alive. It was what kept helping people when you were not in the room. We locked the doors and went home to Zuri. By then, Beatrice had avoided a long prison sentence through the eventual resolution of the charges against her, but the consequences were not light. Her cooperation, lack of prior record, and the way the cases were resolved left her facing probation restitution obligations and court-ordered community service. The irony of where part of that service would be completed had not escaped anyone. First Baptist, the church where she once stood at the center of every women's event, would supervise some of her assigned work. Before that schedule began, Beatrice sent me a message asking to meet. I almost deleted it. Marcus read it and said the decision was mine. He did not ask me to go for his sake. He did not say she deserved closure. He simply reminded me that if I chose to meet her, we would do it in public, and Zuri would be nowhere near it. I agreed to one conversation. Beatrice selected a small coffee shop far from Buckhead. It was the kind of place she once would have passed without noticing. Mismatched wooden chairs, paper menus, chipped ceramic mugs, no valet, no dress code. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner table. For several seconds I did not recognize her. Her hair was pulled back simply. She wore an inexpensive coat, no pearls, no diamond watch, no designer handbag displayed on the chair beside her. The skin beneath her eyes looked tired. Without the uniform of status, she seemed physically smaller. I ordered tea and sat across from her. Beatrice said I looked well. I thanked her. She asked about Zuri. I told her Zuri was healthy and safe. She started to say she missed her. I stopped her. This meeting was not a path to my daughter. If she had asked me there to negotiate access, I would leave immediately. Beatrice lowered her eyes. For once she did not argue. She said probation had made everything difficult. Restitution payments consumed most of what little income remained accessible to her. Harrison was living separately. Church members who once called daily no longer invited her to lunch. Chloe had been struggling to find stable work because the scandal followed her wherever her name appeared online. Connor's case had destroyed the network of people Chloe relied on. Then Beatrice arrived at the real reason for the meeting. She asked me to give Chloe a job at the foundation. Not a leadership role, she said quickly. Nothing important. She knew Chloe was not qualified for finance or management. She would sweep floors, clean bathrooms, carry boxes, anything. Beatrice said blood was still blood, and that humiliating circumstances had taught Chloe enough. She argued that working in the foundation might help her rebuild dignity. I took a slow sip of tea. I asked whether Chloe had applied. Beatrice said no. I asked whether Chloe had contacted me to apologize to Zuri without asking for money work access or relief from consequences. Beatrice looked away. I asked whether Chloe had completed counseling restitution service or any other concrete act showing she understood what she had participated in. Beatrice said I was being cruel. There it was, the old language stripped of the old jewelry. I set my cup down. Help is for people who are ready to change, I told her. It is not a prize for people who are only crying because the mask came off. Beatrice's face tightened. She said Chloe was my family whether I liked it or not. I told her family was not a lifetime employment contract. The foundation existed to support women and girls who needed opportunity, not to provide a private rescue service for people who spent years humiliating the very population we served. If Chloe wanted to rebuild her life, she could start the way millions of people started: take honest work, live within her means, accept being unknown, and learn what kind of person she was without an audience. Beatrice whispered that I had everything now. Money, a company, the house, respect. She asked why I could not afford mercy. I told her mercy and access were different things. I was not trying to put Chloe in prison. I was not trying to prevent her from earning a living. I was not calling employers to sabotage her. I was simply refusing to make myself responsible for repairing the life she helped damage. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. She said Marcus would regret cutting off his mother when I was gone. The threat was weak but familiar. I finished my tea. Then I told her something she should have heard years earlier. Your son deserved a better mother. Beatrice looked as though the sentence physically landed on her chest. I stood, carried my cup to the counter, and paid the check for both of us. When the receipt printed, I returned to the table and placed it carefully in front of her. On Christmas night, she had pointed at my child and told me to take the trash out of her house. I did not need to reenact her cruelty. I did not throw the receipt. I simply left it there, a small, ordinary piece of paper between us. Goodbye, Beatrice. I walked out before she could answer. Before I left the cafe, Beatrice asked one final question. She wanted to know whether I hated her. I considered the answer carefully, because hate would have been simple. Hate would have made her central to my life, and she no longer was. I told her I did not spend my mornings thinking about her punishment. I did not check whether community service embarrassed her. I did not ask Harrison for updates about her loneliness. I did not need her to suffer every day in order for me to feel whole. What I needed was distance, accountability, and safety for my daughter. Beatrice said that sounded like hate dressed in professional language. I shook my head. Hate wants access so it can keep fighting. A boundary wants peace. She asked whether there was any path back to Marcus. I told her that question belonged to Marcus, not me, and she should stop treating me as the gatekeeper for consequences created by her own choices. If she wanted to become a better person, she could do it without the guarantee of a reward. She could serve her probation, repay what she could, tell the truth when it made her look bad, and confront the colorism she had spent decades calling standards. None of those actions required Zuri to be available for reconciliation. Beatrice stared at the receipt after I stood. For once, she did not tell me I was ungrateful. She did not invoke blood. She simply looked tired. That was not redemption. But it was the first conversation I had ever had with her where she did not control the ending. A year after the Christmas dinner that shattered the family. December returned to Atlanta with clear, cold nights and strings of lights wrapped around trees. This Christmas felt nothing like the last one. The following Christmas morning, before the foundation open house, Marcus and I sat at our kitchen table while Zuri colored beside us. He asked whether I ever regretted buying the Buckhead debt when I first recognized the address. I told him no, but not for the reason people assumed. I did not buy it because I knew Beatrice would slap me months later, or because I was waiting to evict her on a holiday. Distressed assets are my business. The file met our criteria. The personal connection made the outcome emotionally complicated, not commercially invented. What I did regret was how long all of us allowed appearances to hide danger. Harrison hid behind quiet. Marcus tried to manage prejudice instead of confronting it. Chloe mistook luxury for character. Beatrice mistook whiteness and wealth for worth. I tolerated insults because I thought surviving them proved strength. Connor saw every weakness in that system and monetized it. Marcus said the new foundation was proof that a broken system could become useful if someone was willing to strip it down to the structure. I laughed and told him he had finally learned to speak like a liquidator. Zuri looked up from her drawing and asked what a liquidator was. Marcus told her it was someone who cleaned up expensive messes. She nodded seriously and said that sounded like Mommy. That little exchange stayed with me when we later stood beneath her framed Christmas picture in the old mansion. The building was no longer a trophy, and the picture was no longer an insult. Both had been given new meaning by what we chose to do next. Connor was in federal prison. The case against him ended with convictions tied to the investment fraud, false representations, and the money he had taken from people who trusted him. The sentence was 15 years. His polished vocabulary, his startup jargon, his claims that everything was a temporary liquidity problem, none of it survived the evidence. The man Beatrice once treated like a symbol of white sophistication entered the federal system as an inmate with no pitch deck left to protect him. Beatrice remained on probation and carried restitution obligations that would follow her for years. Her community service included cleaning and maintenance work at First Baptist. The symbolism was almost too precise. The woman who once entered the sanctuary, expecting people to move aside for her, now arrived in plain clothes, signed in with a supervisor, and cleaned spaces she once ruled through committees and social pressure. Sometimes that meant bathrooms after events. sometimes floors, sometimes storage rooms. People were not instructed to humiliate her, and I did not want them to. The work itself was enough. She was finally doing service that could not be converted into status. Chloe worked nights as a cashier. I learned that fact from Harrison, not because I asked him to monitor her, but because he mentioned it once while discussing a legal document. Her old social circle had vanished. The women who once crowded around her photographs did not appear at the register to help. She rented a small apartment and lived on a budget for the first time in her adult life. Marcus did not celebrate that either. He simply said he hoped she learned something honest from having to earn every dollar. Our boundaries remained intact. No one had access to Zuri because of guilt, nostalgia, or blood. Harrison was the only relative from Marcus's side who slowly earned limited contact, and even that came with conditions. He never defended Beatrice in front of our daughter. He never carried messages. He never asked Zuri to forgive anyone. He showed up when invited, listened more than he spoke, and accepted that trust would be measured in years rather than apologies. Zuri changed too. For months after the first Christmas, she would sometimes ask whether her drawings were messy. Marcus and I never lied to her by declaring every scribble a masterpiece. We told her art was how people practiced seeing the world. Some pictures worked, some did not. What mattered was that no adult had the right to use a child's effort as a weapon against her identity. She kept drawing. That became important on the new Christmas Eve. We celebrated at our own home, not the Buckhead mansion. I wanted the foundation building to belong to its mission, not to become another private palace. Our house was warm, loud, and deliberately ordinary, compared with the status theater Beatrice once demanded. There were blankets on the sofa. Zuri left crayons on the coffee table. Marcus cooked badly and insisted the smoke detector was being dramatic. I made the food he nearly ruined edible again. Zuri placed 3 handmade cards beneath the tree, one for me, one for Marcus. One she said was for herself, because artists should keep examples of their early work. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. After dinner, Marcus gave her a small box containing a printed statement from the Education Trust. The original $250,000 remained protected, and we had added our own structured contributions so the fund could support education without becoming a substitute for discipline or choice. Zuri did not understand the numbers yet. She cared more about the colored pencils taped to the top of the box. That was exactly how I wanted it. I also understood that the final image mattered, because Zuri would grow up with a different memory of that address than the one Beatrice tried to give her. She would remember workshops, books, scholarship interviews, paint on tables, and women building companies. If she ever learned the full story when she was older, I wanted the ending to be larger than punishment. I wanted her to see that adults can inherit ugly systems without preserving them. That is the difference between revenge and rebuilding. Revenge stops when the other person loses. Rebuilding asks what becomes possible after the loss. Connor's sentence protected people from a fraudster. Beatrice's probation forced accountability. Chloe's fall stripped away an identity built on borrowed status. But the foundation created something none of them had managed to create while they were pretending to be powerful opportunity that did not depend on humiliation. So when guests entered the foyer and saw Zuri's framed drawing, they were not looking at a trophy from my victory. They were looking at the first rule of the new house. Nothing honest would be called trash here because of who made it. Money should give a child options, not teach a child she is superior. Later that week, the foundation hosted its first holiday open house at the former Beatrice mansion. Girls from our programs filled the rooms with families, mentors, scholarship recipients, and local founders. There was music in the foyer and hot chocolate in the room, where Beatrice once displayed expensive wine. The old dining room was covered with student projects. No one whispered about which fork to use. Before guests arrived, I stood alone in the entrance hall with Marcus and Zuri. The blank wall above the fireplace was no longer blank. Months earlier, while sorting a box of belongings returned from Christmas night, I found Zuri's original painting. Connor had dropped it after mocking her. One corner was bent. A faint wine stain marked the edge. I had flattened it carefully and stored it in my office. Now it sat inside museum-quality glass in a simple, elegant frame. No giant gold border, no plaque declaring family superiority, Just Zuri's name, her age when she made it, and the date. 5 years old, Christmas. Zuri walked closer and stared at it. Is that mine? She asked. I said yes. She looked at me and at Marcus, then back at the picture. She asked why it was on the biggest wall. Marcus crouched beside her and said, because that wall needed something honest. Zuri accepted the explanation immediately and ran toward the workshop room when she heard other children arriving. I remained in the foyer for a moment. A year earlier, that entrance had represented everything Beatrice wanted me to believe. I lacked old money, social permission, lighter skin, the right connections, the right invitations. She treated the building as proof that her judgment carried more weight than mine. She believed owning the room meant owning the people in it. Now the room belonged to girls whose names she would never have considered important enough for her guest list. That was the revenge that mattered. Not that Beatrice lost a mansion. Not that Chloe lost jewelry. Not that Connor lost his freedom. Those were consequences. The real victory was transformation. A house used to rank people became a place designed to expand them. A child's drawing, once called trash, became the first thing visitors saw when they entered. The money that could have been wasted maintaining appearances now protected Zuri's education and funded real opportunity for other girls. Marcus no longer mistook silence for family peace. I no longer tolerated cruelty just because it arrived wearing tradition. The front doors opened and the foyer filled with voices. I watched Zuri race back through the hallway carrying a stack of paper for the art table. She almost collided with me, laughed, and kept running. Her curls bounced behind her. Her dark skin glowed under the warm lights. She looked exactly like herself. That was enough. Marcus came to stand beside me. He reached for my hand and I rested my head briefly against his shoulder. People sometimes ask whether I planned all of it that Christmas night. Whether I knew when Beatrice's palm hit my face that Connor would go to prison, the church accounts would be exposed, the trust would surface, and the mansion would become a foundation. Of course I did not. I am a liquidator, not a fortune teller. What I knew was simpler. When a system fails, you stop pretending it is stable. You identify the liabilities. You preserve the assets worth saving. You cut away what cannot be repaired. Then you rebuild around something real. That was what I did with the house. That was what Marcus and I did with our family. And that was what I finally did with the idea of legacy. I had spent years proving that I could survive rooms built to exclude me. The foundation taught me something better. Survival was only the first stage. The next stage was building rooms where a girl like Zuri would never have to beg for permission to belong. That was the legacy I wanted her to inherit. Not fear of losing status, but confidence that dignity could never be granted or revoked by someone else's approval. I looked once more at Zuri's framed painting, hanging where Beatrice's portrait used to be. They thought they could throw me into the street with a piece of paper. They forgot something important. I do not just know how to read paperwork. I know how to buy the building that issued it.